something that erupts in a society or emerges in a particular context, etc., but rather think about violence as a part of everyday and part of the what is otherwise called the peaceful times or normal times. So, in a way, since we are talking about violence and society, society is constituted by social identities, right? So, as Nasim in the beginning said, it's difficult to talk about violence without listening to the women, queer people, LGBT people, and they are the most uh, experiencing in terms of violence in most of the societies today. Perhaps one can also think about violence as a something of a constitutive in nature. In a sense, those identities of all kinds are, in a way, in many ways, constituted by violence. Both they constitute the identity, and identity also kind of results in the formation of violence. So, like mutually kind of making each other. So perhaps these are the directions on which one can think about violence as a part of peaceful, normal, everyday lives. So increasingly today we kind of witness across the world, across democracies, the state machinery such as law and judiciary and police often protect the relationships of this domination and subjugation in the name of law and order. Societies reproduce subjugation by creating and also maintaining the norms, values, beliefs through which various discourses, images, representations, and ideologies. So violence is produced each and every day through various practices of this kind and sustained in various axes as sexuality, gender, caste, region, and religion. So these ideologies, not merely as a set of ideas, but rather systematically cultivated, reinforced, and reproduced, and preserved material practices in everyday basis of patriarchy, misogyny, casteism, homophobia, Islamophobia, elitism, etc. So our society continues to demonstrate and ensure the subordination of the specific sections of the society continue to exist. All these ideologies sustain subordination of specific, all these ideologies sustain themselves and reproduce themselves each other. In such a scenario, it is imperative to have an understanding of violence by which physical violence is part of a larger matrix of violence that operates in the levels of discourses, images, representations on the one hand, and the conditions and the places, some of the privileged and others are vulnerable on the other hand. On the one hand, there are kind of discourses, images which reproduce. On the other hand, there are conditions which subjugate the particular identities in any society. So, in many places, one can witness that violence is sustained in the name of law and order. Draconian state policies and actions are often rationalized in the name of development and welfare of the society, while they displace, stigmatize, and push the minority groups to unlivable conditions. An understanding of proper violence is possible by evolving mechanisms not only to grapple with the manifest physical violence, abuse, hatred, etc., but also to seriously engage with the conditions, relationships, the institutions that are central to the and fundamental in producing such violence. Modern institutions of state and bureaucratic uh, uh, bodies often exercise violence not in physical form but in non physical forms. Similarly, societal norms governed by beliefs, values, practices regarding everyday ways of conducting life or the ways one organizes life events often take non physical forms of violence. Nevertheless, there is no denial that often such forms of violence work on human bodies and discipline the ways in which human beings carry themselves to suit the acceptable norms, both public and in private lives. Understanding and acknowledging this necessity is a move that is very significant, very important. So now, let me come to this. Uh, come to this idea that perhaps what makes what I mean, perhaps one can ask, what do you do? I mean, when you have a violence that exists both at the level of discursive kind of a space and also in the form of physical assault and also various ideologies as well as institutions in reproducing and sustaining these various forms of violence. Perhaps what one can uh, do, this is a question which anyone would want to think about it. Perhaps the first step towards politics against violence, I would think, involves acts of naming. Naming something as violence is, in many ways, a dual act. On the one hand, it is done against the authorities that are legitimizing to name what is violence and what is not. In a sense, uh, it is also taking place at the ideological realm, uh, what is violence and what is not violence. Perhaps if a black man is killed by police on the street, state won't take this as a violence. State would say that this is an implementation of law. Whereas a group of people throwing pelting stone at uh, let us say buses or any private property will be treated as a illegitimate violence, and those people will be brought to the law. So perhaps it's also useful to think about what is that ideology that governs what is violence and what is not violence. In such a scenario, it's important to name something as violence. So perhaps that's why you have the term something like state violence. So in a way, it's a kind of intervention in the understanding about violence. Naming is such an important thing. When it comes to societies, I mean, even today, many societies refuse to name certain practices as violence. Very often, these practices are given another name. Uh, Culture is one of the prominent terms in which these forms of violence are named. Perhaps it's a significant move would be to identify and name something as violence, which I call it as a first act of encountering, confronting violence. Uh, Naming something as violence also entails that a specific condition, relationship, or a practice being named is something produced by history and not natural or normal. Perhaps you are intervening there to show that there is something wrong with this particular condition or a practice. So when you say this is violence, obviously you are saying that it has to be changed. This act perhaps can be done in a extraneous position, in a sense, one who names locates herself outside the very logic that so far has been governed and maintained something as normal, natural, acceptable, etc. In a sense, so if there is a logic which uh, defines a practice in a society as something normal or cultural practice or tradition or whatever, so thinking outside this logic of uh, this particular society, one has to name this as a violence. One has to think outside this logic and give a name to this practice. So, in a way, it is also kind of a practice of renaming. In a sense, those practices already have a name. They have a name of a particular kind. You refuse to take this in that particular name and you ascribe another name. You call it as a violence. So, it's also kind of attributing meaning to the particular act as a violence. What state invokes as a law and order to exercise and justify its brutalities? The dominant groups in any society invoke tradition and culture to cover up the violence. Practices of subjugation, domination are often executed and vindicated in the name of cultural practices. Often, the underprivileged groups, particularly women, become bearers of the values of tradition and culture in any society. It is always important to break the sanctity of those cultural and traditional practices, exposing and naming the violence involved in those practices. So this is some kind of uh, initial uh, act, perhaps one can, in terms of confronting the violence. So how much more time I have?
You
Uh,
have 7 minutes.
How many minutes?
Seven.
7 minutes.
Yeah.
So, so in terms of violence, we think about as a discursive practice. Uh, in the at the level of discourse, we have to really confront the violence, and in terms of confrontation, uh, certain certain ways of thinking about violence perhaps is also useful in a sense. Uh, I mean, one can say that I hate violence, I am against violence, uh, non-violence is good. I mean, perhaps we see many uh, thinkers, political leaders advocating non-violence practices, etc. Perhaps I would think that so it is not very useful to have this blanket condemnation for violence. Confronting violence perhaps also involves uh, thinking about violence in various forms and how do they work together as a nexus, etc. Uh, the place where I come from, non-violence is one of the very key terms. It has a historical significance with the Gandhian idea of non-violence. Uh, so, since it's very kind of significant in a place like India to think about non-violence, So I'm suggesting that there is nothing, nothing can be called as, you know, a non-violent method, uh, which is a kind of action which is outside the realm of violence, especially when the violence is almost governing the entire every day. Perhaps one has to think about making distinctions. Perhaps the first act towards a critique of violence should be able to make think a kind of categorizing different forms of violence and how they seem to work together and produce together or work against each other, etc. These are the significant kind of activities one can uh, engage in terms of uh, encountering violence at a discursive level. So perhaps if these are the initial reflections and we can, I mean, any questions and answers session, we can pick up and have a further discussion. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Partha. We'll get back to you later. And I just wanted to ask the participants so to put their questions, if they have any, in the chat box, or later when the final speaker is done with their speech. You can also unmute yourself and ask the question. So just in case we'll have it. Our second speaker is Fred Petrossian. Fred Petrossian is a Brussels-based journalist, researcher, and minority rights advocate. He was the online editor-in-chief of Radio Free Europe's Persian service. He co-edited and co-wrote Hope, Votes, and Bullets on Iranian protest movements based on citizen media. He's also the co-founder of award-winning March 18 movement to raise awareness about blogger safety around the world. Petrossian also was involved with leading digital projects such as Harvard Global Voices, and he has been an international speaker on civil society and citizen media in media and academic centers such as Yale University. Fred recently founded M Voices magazine to defend religious minorities' rights in Iran and to create a dialogue between communities. Welcome, Fred. And yeah, please, okay.
Anyway, thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks a lot to Nasim and Dr. Partha, and for the lesson that he just gave. Is very instructive. I'm going to talk briefly about the theory of violence and this application in Iranian society regarding religious minorities and religious communities. And of course, I will mention several examples about discrimination and persecution against women, because we cannot talk about violence in Iranian culture without mentioning this case. First, let me start with our situation in one of my friends with irony used to say that one thing that Islamic republics was very successful at that was democratization of violence and repression. Meaning that if you look at it, each different groups of Iranian society, they got hurt by violence and discrimination during these 4 decades. I mean, since 79, that Islamic Republic came into power and became Iranian regime. For people who probably don't really follow Iranian stories, Iran is, can be considered as a theocratic state when Iranian government claims that more than 90% of Iranian population are believing in Shiism identify themselves as 12 Imamate Shiite. But recently there was a very interesting survey conducted by Gaman, an organization based in Netherlands and supervised by two Iranian academics, about religious tendencies and beliefs in country. And it's fascinating that about 9% of Iranians consider themselves as atheists. There is only 32% of people who consider them, believing in the official religion of country. And it's a great change in Iranian religious environment. And there are 7% even consider themselves Zoroastrians, and 1.5%, I think, as Christians. And it showed that it's really different, the situation at present comparing to 40 years ago. And in this talk, I just want to start that with reference to an Iranian philosopher, an Iranian Canadian philosopher who is based in India, Ramin Jahanbegloo, who said that Iranian state, Islamic Republic of Iran, in his opinion, cannot act without discrimination against so-called others, like Soviet Union under Stalin or Germany under Hitler. And let's talk now about how this kind of discrimination and so-called and violation and violence against minority works out in Iran. I use the terminology of triangle of violence from a great Norwegian thinker and peace studies, a father of peace studies, Johan Gatland, and that there is direct violence, we have structural violence, and in my opinion, for Iranian society, the most important is cultural violence, because it's a kind of invisible and it's in air, and we transmit that generation to generation. And it's not only that oppressor or people in power transmit that, but minorities transmit that too. First, let's talk about direct violence. Direct violence, as Dr. Parda mentioned, that is very visible in many cases, like the agents come and to your house and arrest you. Why? Because you are accused of having, a meeting with your Christian friends, converts, because Iranian state, shut down Persian-speaking churches and they attack the house churches. Or you are a Baha'i and you have a meeting with your friends, or even not. Even being Baha'i is enough to come to your house and arrest you because you consider it as non-recognized religion, and take your properties or take you to jail. It's a direct violence, and many consider that it's very visible, but in Iran's case, it's very invisible too. For example, if you look at the white torture that happened in prisons, or sexual abuse, or pressure or threats that there will be a sexual abuse, it's a kind of invisible from direct violence that many people don't talk about it, because it's very, very difficult to talk about such experience. Then we come to the structural violence in Iranian society, and is a set of laws and set of policy that the Iranian state put in place regarding different social groups, and in this case, religious communities. I don't use the word minorities here because there are social groups in country that believe in Shiism, but they have a different interpretation of religion, like dervishes, and they got persecuted too. And Iranian system that can be considered as kind of religious apartheid, divide different groups of people based on the religious belief. They don't announce that, loudly, but in practice they do that. For example, according to Iranian constitution, official religion is Islam Shiism. And then you have uh, recognized religions group, like Christians, it means Armenians and Assyrians, not converts, Zoroastrians, and Jewish religion, Jewish people, and Judaism. And they should act within the laws that government and Iranian state established for them. They cannot transgress red lines. And they face discriminations, and many of them left the country. But the worst case are not recognized religions, that they are like ghosts within Iranian state, with Iranian system. For example, like Baha'is, converts, Yarsans, and many others, and the number of millions of people. Then they cannot participate in they are out of many jobs. They can be fired, and it happens a lot from universities, and the properties got confiscated. And even for the recognized religious groups, the violence is very existent. For example, Armenians, Assyrians, Zoroastrians, or Jewish population, like others, participated in Iran-Iraq war in 1980s, and they gave their lives, for their country, defending that and so on. But according to Iranian law, Iranian army cannot hire them. In other words, when there is war, you go, you die for your country, it's your duty. But after that, we don't hire you either. And in many other organizations, they don't hire religious minorities. It's a kind of structural violence because it avoids you to get your needs or your rights. And it's not we cannot consider rights or needs that some people try to impose on us as a relative concept, related to your country or to your culture or society. We just refer to Universal Declaration of Human Rights or other UN conventions that Iran is a signatory to. Besides these two kinds of direct violence and structural violence, that it cost many lives. About 200 Baha'is were executed or murdered in suspicious circumstances after revolution, and some of Iranian Christian leaders were murdered, or one of them and officially was hanged. It means it costs lives directly. And many of them, as I said, left country because economic situation is so bad that they cannot survive. Then we can come to one of the most tricky one is cultural violence. It means that through traditions, norms, beliefs that are so much embedded in our society via different ways, such as media or schools or education or speeches or dominates discourse, that people even transmit that, even don't realize that, and transmit this kind of thinking and thoughts from generation to generation. It happened in other places. For example, when there are slavery business around and trade around, people try to impose this discourse that these slaves are less human than others, and they started dishumanize that. I think it happens in Iranian society. Imagine when there are religious leaders, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, answers questions and consider some of religious groups are impure or najas. Imagine that they are published in websites, official websites, and media that you consider, for example, people at which condition they are impure or not. It's kind of dehumanizing different groups of people. And this or through, via media, you watch Iranian films, produced in Iran, in the way that they treat women in this film, some films, is unbelievable. That there are expressions that we have in our society, in that a woman needs or means a master or a man to protect her. And it's in movies you see that, and the woman doesn't even contest that in the movies. Or during school and books, you see that how genders are separated from each other, and concerning religious minorities, there's so much glorifying one religion, I mean official religion, against the others, and you don't dare to challenge them. But one very extraordinary thing is cultural violence is that some people outside the country support this kind of discourse and idea, meaning that they are not in country to be feared from Islamic regime, try to echo the dominant discourse, but they are outside country, and either they say there's no problem with religious minorities, everything is okay, even if there's a problem, they're just Baha'is, or consider the gender inequality and discrimination and violence. I personally, I watched once via YouTube. There's a film. There's a French Iranian academic. I don't mention the name. She was on one of the very popular French TV, and she was lying. I mean, she was lying in French, but she was lying, and she was saying that wearing hijab or veil, I think obligatory and compulsory, and it's not embedded in Iranian law, but it's because of tradition. People, Iranian women do that, and it was kind of supporting Iranian Islamic violence against women who sent attacking women in the street because they didn't carry veil in an appropriate way according to these Islamists, or put people in prison for that. I mean, it's a kind of, soft power is a part of what cultural violence that we witness that by propagating the lies like that, or when Iranian politicians like Zarif or Ahmadinejad or Rouhani have this CNN or other, mediums that they invited there, and they said that there is no problem with Iranian religious minorities. People don't get arrested because they're Baha'is, or we don't have even, prisoner of conscience in the country. I mean, it's cultural violence embodies a very large part of norms, traditions, but soft power too. That, in my opinion, Islamic Republic will use that in a very clever way. In 2 minutes, I want to mention that because it's a very negative side of the story, but the very positive side of the story is the resistance of both religious minorities, of communities, and women regarding this kind of violence by protesting, by emphasizing on their identity. For example, they protested and demanded, urged to go to the stadium to watch football games, or even some of them were brave and they just move out their veil and film that and publish that and so on. Or Iranian minorities like Baha'is, they were deprived of basic right to go to university. Then they started their own, university online with a great success. I mean, when we have this negative point of events, I mean, imposing violent policy to Iranian minorities, including women, then we have this positive side of the stories about peaceful resistance and being creative on different fronts, from protesting to start the university to resist and avoid de-identification.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Petrossian. If you have any questions for Mr. Petrossian, please leave it in the chat box, or we'll get back to you later after Dr. Ahmad talk. So our last speaker will be Junaid Ahmad. Welcome, Junaid. Dr. Junaid Ahmad has a Juris Doctor law degree from the College of William Mary in the US and a Ph.D. in Islam and decolonial thought from the University of Leeds. He's currently a professor of religion and global politics at Gift University in Pakistan, as well as an advisor on the National Security Unit of the Prime Minister's Office. He's the director of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality in Islamabad. In addition, he's a non-resident research fellow at the Center for Islam and Global Affairs in Istanbul. And Dr. Junaid has been teaching law, religion, and politics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences and the University of Management and Technology since 2009. Junaid's research interests include Islamophobia, Islamic revivalist movements, US foreign policy in Middle East and South Asia, human rights and international law, globalization, critical issues in contemporary Islam, and he has written extensively on these topics. Welcome, Junaid, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nasim, and Assalamu alaikum, and peace and blessings be upon all of you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I want to thank, first of all, Nasim and the organizers and my fellow colleagues and panelists for this event that hopefully we have hundreds of thousands of viewers looking at and watching very carefully because of its importance. And I think that the issues raised by the other speakers point to some of the most, I think, pressing issues that we confront today, right now, in trying to unpack this broad theme that we've been given, violence and society. Now, since it's a very broad theme, I will in turn return the favor by speaking in very broad terms, and then we can, in discussion, I think we can get into whatever details or specific questions that individuals may have. And I mean, I certainly appreciate the other colleagues of mine is focusing specifically on certain countries and certain abuses going on there. So but I want to try to give a broader framework that people may or may not agree with, but then we can have a healthy discussion afterwards. So to just begin with, and so that I don't go over time, I want to offer some of these reflections. The issue of violence in the modern world system, and since I come from a sociology background, the topic itself is very much located in sort of the field of sociology. Of course, it extends. I mean, now we know that this kind of these compartmentalization of these different disciplines is largely fictitious, and that it's very interdisciplinary. But I want to begin by putting my cards on the table, that I approach the question from from a very Wallersteinian approach. Melner Wallerstein developed world systems analysis, and in which it's the primary unit of analysis and understanding what has been transpiring for the past 500 plus years is not necessarily the unit of analysis is the nation itself, but actually a world system that was created in the long 16th century. 1492 is a useful date for that, if you want to really date it. But of course, the long 16th century, meaning 1450 to 1650, in which you have the development of what Ramon Grosfoguel calls, the colonial scholar at UC Berkeley, the epistemic, racist, sexist, colonial capitalist world system. Okay, and so, and the issue here related to the topic of violence, I mean, just from that very title of describing the world system, one can get a sense that yes, this is going to cause incredible levels of violence in all sorts of forms. But even the original, quote unquote, original sin of the emergence of this world system entailed what I call the 4 epistemicides, genocides of that period. Yeah? And I don't want to you to feel as if, okay, well, that's that period and this is, but no, I think they're fundamentally very related. The origins of this modern world system, 500 years plus, which I think is fortunately on the decline, but I think it's very much related to what we see today, the ongoing violence that we see today. And those, to go very quickly, we obviously know about the genocidal adventures of all of these kind of so-called discoverers and so on, whether in the Americas, whether in other parts where European colonizers went. We saw later on not too much later on, we saw what happened with the transatlantic slave trade is a very euphemistic term, more like the kidnapping of African bodies and enslaving them, and the extreme brutalization and violence against them, which happened in England as well, but abolished earlier than in the Americas, where it expressed itself in the most brutal way. We saw multiple epistemicides as well. Actually, and another genocide, which is rarely spoken about at that time period. We often speak about the issue of Islam and gender, and the problem that is that Muslim societies have with the question of misogyny and patriarchy and this thing. At that time, what we often don't recall is that during this entire process, not only were these kind of genocidal approaches taking place towards the rest of the world, and what I call the epistemicides taking place, that is the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems, whether in the Americas, whether in Muslim Andalusia, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians, etc., were living there. Literally the destruction of libraries, right? I mean, so the largest library in the world at that time was in Cordoba, about 500,000 books. Second in Granada. London had about the biggest library in Europe was about 5,000 books in London. Okay, so literally we're talking about the epistemicide, the destruction of knowledge structures of various communities, and the other genocide, and you may call it an epistemicide simultaneously at that time, which we don't really remember, is that of what we often call of these European burning of witches. It was basically a genocidal campaign, and now we have more research done into this, showing that the figures are far greater than they were believed to be, of women in Europe. Those women, precisely not because whatever this erroneous notion of witches is, because they had preserved oral traditions, wisdom traditions, etc., that they guided other women by, even some men by, and so on. But the deeply patriarchal nature of that society could not handle that. So in some ways, these were the 4 epistemicide genocides upon which this, like I said, this epistemic, racist, sexist, colonial capitalist system was born. So that's very important to understand that, okay, now when we speak about what's going on, whether over the past centuries or even today, it's important to understand, because I also think We are in an age of transition. I think that people can see it. What someone like Wallerstein has been arguing, the late Emmanuel Wallerstein, since the since the early 70s, in fact, now it's becoming increasingly visible to us that we are living in an age of transition in a very chaotic world system. We don't know exactly which direction it's going into, but we do in some ways see that this long trajectory of this 500-year plus world system is coming to an end. And the reason I point to that is that from that we can then derive some of the fundamental sources, right, of violence and violent acts, of specific manifestations, okay? The broad kind of sources, whether it be based on what I described as the world system as being, whether it be the issue of and one of the principal ones being the nation state itself, right? There was mention by our colleague about the othering process within nations themselves, and I would argue, I think, quite easily that this is not unique to Iran, Pakistan, India, or any other. This is the process of inventing nations themselves. As most of you will be familiar with, Benedict Anderson, but not just Benedict Anderson, many others. This is not just a problem of the post-colonial state trying to invent or imagine a community. This is a problem of Europe itself as well. So nations did not form states. States and their national bourgeoisies, the emerging whatever capitalist class, they invented nations in which necessarily some communities were going to be otherized. And that has been a process, and it's not just a process of the global South. That's from the very inception in Europe itself. So this is one of the, I think, the sources, and I can argue that very well. I'll get back to that in a second. That was in some ways the main source of violence throughout the 20th and 21st century. The nation state, and particularly the most powerful imperial nation states. Secondly, the issue of a white supremacist world order, a very racist world order in which, as Fanon would say, there's a zone of being and a zone of non-being, in which you can have a large demonstration and protest for, on whatever issue it may be, even for secession in Spain, for example, in the Basque region or so on, without and it will look like actually a festival and a party rather than and nothing happens. As opposed to you get 2-3 Palestinians together to start the protest and they'll be shot like pigeons. So this is what when we talk about the zone of being and zone of non-being, this is what Fanon was speaking about. In the zone of being, protests and these types of things are managed through kind of regulation, concessions, some type of reforms, sometimes violence as well, as we see clearly right now in the US. But of course, this is also part of the crisis of that Western hegemonic project of the past 500 years. That's why we see the violence that was exported throughout the rest of the world coming back home. And versus, again, like I said, the zone of non-being, in which the principal mode of dealing with demands and protests of the social majorities, ordinary working people, has been repression, has been violence, and so on. So that's another thing. The still white supremacist world order continues. Third, patriarchy and toxic masculinity. Again, that has continued to survive. We see it. The other panelists described very well how that continues to linger, and the harmful effects it has on women throughout the world. They take different manifestations. We go over this argument all the time. Yes, they take different manifestations in different societies, but we see that one thing that this shows, if the United States right now is not a good example, especially, at least under Trump, is that history. One of the things we have to, I think, debunk, and I think all of us are more than intelligent to know this, that history is not some linear teleological progress narrative that we have been sold, that in fact one can go back generations and generations and that's the same forms of whether it be racism or sexism and patriarchy, etc. Those can reemerge overnight if you have conditions that create movements and leaders that emerge that want to take you to basically what we call a revanchist type of approach to their societies and so on. So these are not fixed. These kind of, okay, well, this country has accomplished such and such, and these countries have not. Well, those countries may have accomplished something through social movements of whether it's minorities of African Americans in the U.S. the African Americans, the women's movement, and so on. And so they're accomplished, but you have to struggle and you have to keep fighting for them, as certainly the Trump years have demonstrated to us very clearly. So based on my analysis of kind of what the world system has been for the past more than 500 years, at least since 1492 or the long 16th century, and these fundamental sources of violence. I want to move very quickly, and Nasim, if I end early, you should be very happy, because usually you'll have to cut me off at some point. So just don't tell me that, oh yeah, you have 5 more minutes or something like that. Just don't even say that. Let it end early.
Actually, Junaid, you have a lot of questions to answer here, so
right.
You better wrap up.
Right, exactly. No, I noticed at the beginning you said, no, you have 5 or 6 more minutes. I was like, don't say that to me, okay? Please, just don't say that to an academic. Anyways, but the final thing, I do want to get to the contemporary period. So you take this huge jump, although again, understanding that colonial part of that kind of the epistemic, racist, sexist, colonial capitalist world system, the colonial modernity. So modernity, the way that it comes in the quote unquote West. And here, when I speak about the West, I'm not speaking about a geographic entity. I use the notion of Talal Asad's, the great anthropologist, his definition of the West as a universalizing hegemonic project, right? In which the sacred cows of modernity that we come to understand today, whether it's the nation state, whether it's the market, whether it's all of these things that supposedly for the 3/4 of the rest, actually even more, 80% of the rest of humanity must adopt their own processes of unfolding, whether it's secularization processes, all of these things must look identically the same as basically Northwestern Europe, and how their issues with their religion and so on and all of these things took place. And so in some ways, I mean, these are there's much more time needed to get into these discussions. But what the modernity that the colonized, the global South experienced was a colonial modernity, right? It was not a modernity. England could call itself a democracy in the 19th century, where 90% of its subjects have absolutely no vote in what it does or whatever, but it could still call itself a democracy. John Stuart Mill can speak on liberty sitting in Calcutta, while the Bengali women there who are producing the best textile cloth in the world, while their fingers are being chopped off because they're out producing the textile mills in Lancaster in England. So, anyways, and again, we should not see these things as exceptions, like you're on like as if you're well, okay, I'm on summer vacation, rules don't apply here and whatever. It's just no, these are not the exceptions. These were the rule, actually. This is how that whole colonial process unfolded. And the problem after that post-colonial, when the post-colonial decolonization period happened, at least political decolonization happened, is that there was a lack of imagination, political imagination by many of the movements that were leading these anti-colonial movements, in terms of how to actually not only decolonize politically, but decolonize epistemologically, how to conceive of societies in a different way that did not enact the type of that type of colonial violence, that type of colonial pillage, and that whole history, the trajectory of that world system that preceded it. This was a problem with many of the movements that just were told, look, or told themselves, we need to catch up. It's a catch-up process. How do we catch up and become like the quote-unquote West and these societies, etc.? And how do we learn in them? And then we have a lot of phenomena that variously called, whether it's this modernization, nothing wrong with that, but being equated with Westernization, and whether it's Kemalism, whether it's this and that. Throughout the Muslim world, we speak about how Islamism has become such a hegemonic force, and with all of its problems, etc. We also have to remember that the first 3, 4, 5 decades after independence for many of these countries, Islamism did not dominate these societies. It was, in fact, movements of the secular left, nationalists, socialists, the Baathists in the Middle East, largest communist party outside of China was in Indonesia, in Sudan, etc. And the problem was that many of these, again, that vision of the kind of industrial kind of capitalist West that they had, they then degenerated into many of them, not all of them, degenerated one-party authoritarian states and so on. So there's also a context in which you see the rise of Islamism then happen as a response to the betrayal, in some ways, the failed promises of many of these national liberation movements to the people. I mean, I'm someone that's very connected to South Africa, for example, and one goes there and just is incredibly saddened by this heroic struggle that took place there, anti-apartheid struggle, and you see actually the situation there in which you have statistics like the Gini coefficient, inequality has only increased. The condition of the Black majority is still the same, if not worse, than it was under apartheid. And of course, these things are incredibly disturbing, okay? So, I mean, I want to say that as well, that these post-colonial regimes in the global South, one of the problems, and this is kind of what I will end with at the end, is that the impoverishment of their imagination to actually decolonize sufficiently, beyond just political decolonization, decolonize in a whole host of other domains as well. But let me very quickly speak about the era right now, still ongoing. We don't know when it's going to end. It's permanent war. It's a permanent war on terror and so on and so forth. One of the things that we have to be very careful about, and of course, folks here would be familiar with Edward Said's great work, Orientalism in 1978, and how that really transformed, many, many disciplines in terms of understanding the way the West represented, misrepresented, whatever you want to call it, the Orient, but which is what I call soft Orientalism, that type of an approach in which it allowed itself to kind of, okay, this is the ideological justification for us to kind of the white man's burdens, the civilizing mission, and so on, and to colonize these places. But the hard Orientalism, in which the Orient is essentially constitutive of the West itself, that in fact that was in some ways needed, the Orient, Islam, whatever you want to see, the idea that story was not so much about the East as it was about the West itself, the story that it wanted to tell about itself. We often speak about kind of our own kind of Judeo-Christian civilization. Where does this come? This was not used before World War II. Judeo-Christian civilization. We all know the situation of Jews historically in Europe, which is why you had many Jewish communities after the expulsion of Andalusia from Andalusian Spain go to Muslim societies. I mean, people ask, where do these Jewish communities in these various Muslim societies come from? Well, that's where it was. They had to flee Christian Europe from that time all the way up until the 20th century. And the most tragic part is that in many parts of the Muslim world, they have imported Western anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish racist tracks, polemics, etc., into their own societies now. That's the most tragic part of that. But in why I raise the issue of Orientalism is that we have to be very careful during this period of the war on terrorism, in which the so-called war on terror, by the way, in which I think of Chomsky's term back in 1978, political economy of human rights, in which he distinguished him and Ed Herman, the idea of wholesale violence or terror and retail violence and terror. The wholesale violence and terror, as someone else mentioned as well, of states, nation states, and this is where I was talking about, Ashish Nandi, in Indian writer. He says that less than close to 1 to 2% of violence in the 20th century, if that, can be attributed directly to, in some ways, to kind of religious violence between communities. 98%.
Dr. Ahmad, sorry for interrupting you, but your time is over now.
Okay, it's over. So can I just say one last thing?
Okay, sure.
One last thing. So I think that that point I made clear, but the thing is that we have to be very careful that we do not recycle the cliches of the colonial times. That in fact our movements, whether they're feminist movements, anti-racist movements, etc., that we do not get co-opted and appropriated by imperial violence that does far more violence throughout. I mean, we can see it over the past 20 years. So I think this is the caution that I would leave us all with, that let us not let our genuine movements against these specific areas where the sources of violence get co-opted by the very powerful nation states, imperial states in the world today, as part of their projects to supposedly civilize the Muslim world, when in fact it's about recolonizing not only the Muslim world, but large parts of the global South. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Junaid. So now the session is open to questions and answers. We already got several questions here. Professor Yaqubi just left comments. Said, thank you, Mr. Petrossian, for speaking about cultural violence and minoritized populations of Iran, an underrepresented and understudied area. And she had to leave to another webinar. So I will start with the first question. Dr. Behruz Parhami says, Dr. Partha seemed to suggest that violence is a relative concept. One society's violence may not qualify as violence in another. So the dictionary definition of violence, behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something is unequivocal, though. Can you cite a specific example of your relativistic idea? So this is for Partha. Dr. Partha, do you have any answers?
Should I start responding, Nasim?
Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. In fact, I was suggesting the other way around, in a sense that it's in certain kind of a relativism which posits that this is a very specifically culturally specific realm, that you cannot understand this particular practice. So I was suggesting that it is important to name such practice, or indeed rename this practice as violence, and refuse to accept that as a culture or a tradition. Having said that, it is also important to pay attention to the possibilities where, in the name of universalism, it is possible to export violence. I mean, we have the recent history of waging war against countries in the name of human rights and democracy. So it's more of a how we understand violence is more of a historically grounded understanding is very significant, and there is no such yard scale to come and apply across the world. This is violence. So that's what I would quickly say. I think at the same time, it is also it is also important to recognize the forms of violence which are very much part of a particular culture and society, and to transform it. There is no point in thinking about uh, you know east and west kind of distinctions, and keep reproducing and sustaining the violence within one's society. Yeah, there is no relativism. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Partha. So there is another question from Jasmine Darznik to all the panelists. What are the most meaningful ways those of us outside of, for example, Iran, do not support the efforts of those within the country to address and redress the violence inside their countries and communities? So I think Fred is the right person to answer this question, or anybody. What do you think?
I just opened the discussion. I think sometimes it's very difficult when you are outside an outsider to help people who are inside country. But I think there are different ways to help Iranian civil society. I mean, people who are in a country like, I don't know, in a European country or in the States, um, talking with the parliamentaries, for example, in European Parliament, they, they, they were in touch with Iranians for several times, talking about issues, but raising the issues of human rights or women's rights or minority rights or whatever during the discussions and putting that on the table. I think it's just happened during, and under apartheid in South Africa or other places. But according to my experience and talking with other people who are active in this side, for example, European parliamentaries are not really, it's much more about trade than human rights. Which is understandable, by myself, because it's a question of their national interest. But the way to push that is via the political parties and associations, which has something to say and put this issue on the table. It can work out. Regarding Iranian women going to stadiums, for football, it works out and somehow, but by pushing via FIFA to do that. I think it can work out if they go through their own associations, civil rights movements and political parties to put these issues on the table in a very concrete way.
Thank you. There's also another comment.
Nasim,
Yes?
can I very quickly add to that? Just very quickly.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
Right. Just 2 points. I think one is oppose the belligerent kind of warmongering rhetoric that is coming from the United States and to some extent from its junior partner Britain as well. That is the first and foremost, because all that does, this constant warmongering rhetoric, is hardened, is of course the hardliners in Iran, etc., makes it very, very difficult for actual grassroots activists and social movements, whether on women's rights and so on, minority rights, to actually do their work. And the solidarities that must be built are not between the movements there and other nation states, but between social movements in other countries and the social movements in Iran. Those are the transnational solidarities we need to address these issues. But the first and foremost, people sitting outside, their principal task is to oppose any type of militaristic war on Iran, which we are hearing lots about. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Junaid. So the next question is from Professor Margola. Is there any continuity between the Shah regime and the Islamic Republic regarding the treatment of minorities? This is a question to Fred Petrossian. Would you like to answer it?
Yeah, sure. Well, when we look at minorities issues, Andrew Shah, religious minorities, I think it's the same. It's the kind of, don't make me mistaken. It's nothing comparable because things became 1,000 times worse, and even there was some kind of tolerance regarding religious minorities, which was not enough, of course, under Shah, but it becomes very much worse under the regime. But there was, for example, I just read a few weeks ago in Isfahan, there was a magazine published by some kind of intellectual Christians under Shah, talking about intellectuals between Islam, Christianity, and so on. But under the pressure of Islamic organization, which was very active under Shah, and Shah was very tolerant regarding them because he probably thought they were stopping communism and Marxism, not overthrowing his own regime. They shut down the magazine and they told them the Islamists were against that and they complained that and we were forced to shut it down. But there was some tolerance regarding religious groups such as Baha'is, which Islamists were against that. And after revolution, it becomes a kind of disastrous for them or for converts. I think we cannot compare these two regimes regarding minorities with each other.
Yeah, thank you so much. The other question is from Dr. Parhami. Says, Dr. Ahmad, since unfortunately the panel does not include a woman, provide greater insight in the large fraction of violence in the world committed against women, I would like to ask you to give your views on seriousness of gender-based violence. In particular, is it the case that violence is committed primarily by those in power against the powerless or marginalized groups?
Okay, so the first, I think that may be two separate things, but the first thing in terms of gender-based violence, so I was on the board in Washington, D.C. of DVRP. It's a domestic violence resource project, which works largely with Asian communities and so on. And we made it very clear that, of course, while this is the communities that we are working in, that we're from and that we're working in, that we're not going to fall into this kind of cultural racism that, okay, well, these are the communities that only have kind of gender-based violence and so on. And of course, we hear this term of the honor crimes that, that exists in Pakistan and Jordan. And then, of course, they sound so much more vicious and evil than, say, what we can in the United States, that often in the court of law, I have a legal background, we would often confront cases where, oh, well, it was just a crime of passion committed by a jealous husband or a jealous boyfriend, etc. And that, of course, is nothing, that's okay. It's not doesn't sound as bad as an honor crime, etc. So we have to be careful about that. But to specifically answer that question, at least the first part of it is that this is, in some ways, I think that my analysis is that gender-based violence, which emerges from what I said earlier, from that patriarchal world system, and it's what we see so visibly now, the toxic masculinities that it has produced throughout the world. So in fact, for me, that is probably the oldest form of kind of oppressive hierarchy in the world. I mean, as opposed to traditional Marxists, I do not think classes. I think patriarchy even precedes class division. So, I mean, it is a struggle. I mean, obviously, these are systems that have been in place for a very, very long time. And so the violent part is, of course, I mean, that's gruesome and that must be condemned. But unless we actually dig into the roots of what it is, of what type of, how the society is structured around patriarchal norms and practices and hierarchies and so on, and how that generates all forms of toxic masculinities, until and unless we acknowledge that, we will see a gender-based violence that will continue. That's not to say we shouldn't have groups like us confronting it, DV shelters, and so on. Of course, but in some ways these are band-aids to a larger problem that we have to address head on. That women's movements have addressed, and they need their male allies to confront this. That's the only way I see it. I mean, Nasim, was there a second part of that question that was something else, or did I?
So I would like to ask you to give your views on seriousness of gender-based violence. In particular, is it the case that violence is committed primarily by those in power against the powerless or marginalized groups?
Right. Okay. Well, let me just take that as a separate question then, because I think I've conveyed to you the seriousness of gender-based violence, and actually the real seriousness of the system of actually the system of patriarchy that structurally defines that society and engenders these horrific forms of gender violence throughout the society. But the second question is an interesting one, because here's the question of violence in general. So is the violence of the oppressor, should it be morally equivalent to the violence of the oppressed? And I would answer no. So the violence of the slave master against the slave versus the violence of or the armed kind of whatever type of violence of the slave to liberate themselves from that enslavement, I don't think they're morally equivalent. So to answer precisely that question, it's like anti-colonial. I mean, nowadays we speak about how kind of, well, you know, the Palestinian struggle, Kashmiri struggle, all these very Muslim struggles. The only problem is they don't have some type of a Nelson Mandela or a Gandhi or a non-violent type of, because you know, because they're so violent, and that's a problem, and they're full of terrorists. Well, you know, one thing I will remind our viewers is that which they may not know, Nelson Mandela went to jail not for his Gandhian a non-violent approach. He went to jail specifically on the charge of founding the MK, the armed wing of the African National Congress. And not only that, Nelson Mandela could have been freed at least 10 years earlier if he, in principle, just said, we renounce the armed struggle. He refused to, and he stayed in jail for 10 years longer. So we also have to understand it's a different time that we're living in today. The anti-colonial struggles, etc., the violence that was inflicted by the colonial powers was one thing. And yes, there was armed struggle against that. And by the way, in international law, occupied peoples, it says that they have the right to resist, and it does not specifically say whether it could be armed or unarmed, violent or non-violent. Of course, we all wish that these movements are non-violent in their opposition. But when we see a condition of the Palestinians of you know, now more than 70 years since for the creation of Israel, international community violation of resolution one by one by the Israelis, etc. You know what? Sometimes it's very understandable why people will take up arms to defend themselves against these types of occupation. So I don't find them morally equivalent. And yes, you do have cases in which even of course, when the oppressed actually fight back through an armed struggle. That's always been the case.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Junaid. So there is another question, which I think is very interesting. All right, here it is. So Ozlem is asking a question, and I would like to pose it to Partha as well. So Junaid and Partha, both of you, is it possible to evaluate the emergence of nation states as the contractual appearance of violence through the state laws basing on social contract theories, defining the borders between zones of being and zones of non-being?
My dear friend Partha can begin first.
Should I come in? Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
I think there are various things put together in one question. Uh, Perhaps I can address one or two segments of the question. One is that the question of sovereignty, very often, uh, one of the concepts uh, we need to think in relation to violence is question of national sovereignty, nation state and its sovereignty. Very often, I think it's central to even the Junaid's presentation, like uh, kind of respecting the uh, nation's sovereignty, and you know how does one address the question uh, within the sovereignty of a particular nation or a state. So this becomes a significant question. Historically, if you speak in the context of India, one of the kind of very prominent issues in Indian society is a caste system. So when there was a conference in South Africa, Durban, against racism, some of the groups, activists wanted to represent the caste issue in South Africa as a form of racist practice. So the Indian state uh, kind of denied this issue as a something of a racism and presented this as an issue which is to be resolved within the uh, sovereignty of Indian state. So the sovereignty doesn't work only with the nation states. It works with the religion, it works with family, it works with community, it works, the logic works in a very different, in a micro level. The issues to be tackled within the sovereignty. So that is one part of the question. I think the non-being and being, which came up in the presentation of Junaid, uh, I think Feno is also kind of an important figure to invoke in the context. It's about Feno. For Feno, this is about the colonial situation where there is a white man's settlement and there is a black man's settlement. In the white man's settlement, it's full of belly of good things, happy going around kind of things. On the other hand, in the black man's settlement, it's kind of a hungry town, all kind of. So it's a kind of this distinction which one kind of thinks about in terms of colonial context, seem to have reproduced within the post-colonial national space. Partly, I would agree with Junaid that it has origins with colonial modernity, but I would also think that uh, it is not something that you can uh, trace the source to modernity and as if the indigenous forms of violent practices are not so horrible or anything. So in a way, partly the colonial practices of violence get reproduced in the national space. Uh, if you look at most of the uh, post-colonial countries in the south, many of them, many of the institutions are basically nothing much of a change, but same institution remains in the. For instance, I'm not sure about Pakistan. In India, at least, you can see whether it is a police or bureaucracy, the colonial structure continues to exist in the post-colonial state and continues to produce the various forms of this, uh, you can say, new colonial kind of a condition where there are beings and there are zones of non-being, etc. So these are the two things I can say quickly. Perhaps Junaid maybe.
Yeah. Junaid, can you just put a comment on it, like very short, because we have several questions to address. If you
Sure,
want.
absolutely. Very short. You had to add that
Very
in.
short.
Okay. No, I agree completely with what was said, and I think that what has happened. Yes, of course, we before the modern world, we the sovereigns and the divine kings and all of that. But in the modern world system I've described, you have had this the sovereign, the almost godlike sovereign has been this nation state, and of course you've had these nice liberal theorists talk about the social contract and all of these things. Very nice on paper, but in practice, what has happened? The kind of liberal social contract has been more than compatible with genocide, slavery, colonialism, you name it. I mean, so it's the point that I made earlier. And the sovereign state, in its proto-nationalist phase, still where kind of it was a very Christianizing that type of mission. So first it was Christianize or we'll kill you to the rest of the world. Then it was civilize or we'll kill you. Then it's develop or we'll kill you. Human rights away. So all of these things have been used. The sovereign nation state, particularly of the powerful states, which then imported, as I was saying, to the post-colonial nation state, in which, again, the lack of imagination about how to really decolonize from that type of world system, in which this nation state bears enormous influence, not only in the shaping of the way you live, of the way of being in the world, of shaping how religion should look and act like and behave like, all of these things, and this is when we speak about secularism, another Talal Asad famous thing. It's not about this very kind of simplistic notion of separation of religion and politics, or religion and the state. As Talal Asad argues, it's this great sovereign. What has happened is this, in the late 19th century, this great sovereign nation state. It's its management of religion by the state, the way it wants to manage it, and the way it wants to see how religion should and should not look like. So that is what we are confronting with, and I think that this hits the nail on the head. That in fact it is that very sovereign, this so-called sovereign nation state that claims sovereignty over so many things and all of this. But I think that is one of the principal problems in terms of systemic, large-scale violence throughout the world today.
Thank you, Junaid. So Professor Handelman says, I'm not sure if I heard correctly, so it is a request for clarification. Fred Petrossian, I believe, quoted a friend in his opening remarks, referring to the notion of democratization of violence in the Islamic Republic of Iran, or something of the sort. I would truly appreciate if he could elaborate more about the idea, and if I misheard the sentence, my profuse apologies. Do you have any?
Yes, sure. I said one of my friends with irony used to say, it's an irony, that one thing that Islamic Republic was successful at, that it was democratization of violence and repression. By saying that's a kind of, using a black humor, saying that everybody got really repressed, most of people, and the violence was upon, most of people. It's the kind of irony that he used to say that.
Yeah, thank you. And this question is from Professor Parhami to Mr. Petrossian, but it's an interesting question, so I want all of you to comment on it or to share your thoughts with us about it. It seems that religious dogma is responsible for the most heinous kinds of violence, whereas culture wars, such as the issue of hijab, serious as they are, rarely lead to genocide or homicide. Do you agree with this stratification? So, who wants to go first? And first, it is for Mr. Petrossian.
Yeah, I go first. It's under forced circumstances, because it was mentioned. Okay, One thing that when I talk, I just focus on Iran because there's about 4 decades that we live a kind of a theocracy, and its violence it goes on, and we just we can mention tons of examples that that in recent years that happened. But one thing that I want to mention that I really like to talk about is that when we talk about the cultural violence, one point, I think the worst point of it is a kind of internalizing and embedding within people on both sides, meaning dominating on oppressors and oppressed, a kind of norms. For example, for the minorities who got suffered, they start to believe that they are, some of them of course, inferior, or they don't have any place in that country, and they start to live in their own ghettos, and even they got disconnected with other minorities who have the same rights and who got suffered and persecuted in the same under same circumstances. And on the other side, the people who dominate started. I don't even use the term of Shiites or male Shiites because it's not true. Because people can become atheists or take distance regarding their own religion, but they still carry the same norms of superiority. One good example that happened a couple of years ago, there was a great Kurdish Iranian mathematician who won, the top prize in mathematics worldwide, and he put the message in his own language, his mother tongue, in Kurdish, on website that he celebrates his victory. He's based in UK, by the way. And then Iranians, some Iranians who are not even Islamists and who are again, considered as opposition, started to become angry with God, even insulted him because he uses his mother tongue, Kurdish, not Persian, to celebrate, his victory. It shows that this kind of superiority is so much these norms embedded in some of us. Even nobody raised the question why it happened, why he didn't use Persian instead of Kurdish, and what we are doing with these people, and that they are so got oppressed that they use this kind of the mother tongue rather than so-called official language. It's kind of cultural violence that embedded in us. Regarding of women and in Iranian situation, I think it's under religious dogma that Iranian state can get involved from what you wear to which God you worship. I mean, from the veil of women to to the different religions, he tries to impose its own point of view. And why we don't see the mass killing of women in under Islamic Republic, we saw this kind of gradual suffering and persecution for 40 years. For example, when we have this news that father killed his daughter because she ran away with a guy or she was in love with other one that they wanted to get her married. We see that this kind of violence manifests itself because of established and structural laws that Islamic Republic put in society, and it goes on for 40 years. And we cannot, mark that this murder happened at that time because of, Islamic Republic ordered that. But it happens in many cases because structural laws let it happen under religious state.
Thank you. So is there any other thoughts on this from Partha or Junaid?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah, if I may. Very quickly. Very quick. One thing, and that'll be hopefully Nasim can organize another thing on that. But But just on because obviously the question of Iran keeps coming up. One of the things that always should be very obvious to us is that any revolution for that matter, whether the Islamic Revolution in Iran, doesn't come out of the blue. It comes from a certain context, and I think that we have to be very clear that we don't downplay the incredible repression and crimes of the Shah of Iran. So there's a certain context in which large numbers of Iranians, women included, protest against this Shah and are for something different, which of course turns into something that also is equally oppressive. But we also have to be very clear that the Shah of Iran was no paradise under his rule. But to come to this issue of religious violence, right? There's one book, or if you don't want to read the book, there's YouTube lectures by him I would recommend. It's by William Kavanaugh, and it's The Myth of Religious Violence. Okay, and I think that and of course in the present period, I mean, I can go into it, but the interesting thing is that we also think about, the earlier period in Europe, the 30 Years' War, as these kind of religious wars that took place, etc., that needed this secularism as the solution. Whereas he argues that basically these were wars of proto-nationalism. These were wars of the proto-incipient phases of these nation states emerging, carving out their own space. And when we're speaking about today, and even the examples kind of mentioned now, it's about that nation state otherizing, whether it be a religious minority, an ethnic minority, whatever type of others that don't fit into again, what I said, it's not nations which have created states. It has been states with their powerful rulers that have invented nations. And in those nations, those communities that they don't think that fit have, yes, experienced incredible marginalization. So I would highly caution, because this is the dominant discourse, right? That yes, it's religious hatreds between these communities, etc. Particularly when speaking about the global South, and particularly when speaking about the Islamic Eighth World. I mean, we don't speak about, when we talk about, for example, this is very Orientalist. When we speak about some conflict between France and Germany, which have now waged about 240 wars against each other over the past 500 years. We don't speak about them, age-old tribal or religious or whatever, these types of conflicts. It's about something. It's about something political. It's about the Rhineland. It's about something. But when we speak about, say, in the Middle East, in Iraq and Syria, it's the Shia-Sunni hatreds for thousands of years, etc. A very Orientalist way of analyzing the rest of the world. Whereas when we analyze, quote unquote, ourselves, the developed world, we have a very different framework. So I would very much caution that this idea of this religious violence is largely a myth, and that there are other factors, particularly the way the modern nation state has been constructed, that is responsible for the far, far greater levels of violence in the world.
Thanks so much.
Maybe.
Yeah, Dr. Partha, please.
So I was thinking about, coming back to this democratization of violence. The his friend was ironically mentioning. Perhaps it's worth thinking about the relationship between violence and modern democracy. There is this assumption that that these two are kind of placed in the opposite poles. That when there is democracy, there is no violence, kind of idea. Perhaps not only democracy, and any political form inhabits certain forms of violence. One cannot deny the fact that there is a violence inherently there in the political form of democracy and its compatibility with modern capitalism, right? So that is one point. Coming back to the other points, a question which came a few minutes ago about the violence of those who are oppressed and those who are oppressed and marginalized. That one. Perhaps it's useful to think about violence as a kind of systemic kind of phenomenon uh, in a non essential way, in a sense that it is very much possible that in a capitalist society, the working class groups perpetuate and strengthen the systemic violence which is harmful for themselves. Just because they are working class, it is not that they are against the capitalist forms of violence. They can very well reproduce. In that sense, we should think in terms of subjective dispositions uh, in a non essential way. Perhaps that will be useful. So, this is another point. Maybe further, if there are any questions, we can take it up.
Thank you so much. Ozlem, do we have any other questions? I think we're almost done. Um, all right, any final comments? Even the participants could comment on something. That's more than welcome. We have a few more minutes left.
Can I add a few words to my question?
Sure, Dr.
Yeah,
Parhami, please.
yeah, I asked about gender-based violence and linked it to violence by the powerful or those in power against marginalized communities, because gender-based violence is primarily about power, because one gender has the power, the other one is oppressed or marginalized. So it's no different from colonial power, for example, exerting violence against people of countries that they conquer. It's just a matter of power in both cases. So that's why I lumped those two questions together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Okay, anything else to say? If not, we are
Nasim.
gonna take off. Yeah.
Nasim, one thing.
Yes, sure, sure.
Right. Just to hit home the last point, and I forgot to mention this about this again, religious violence, state violence, etc. All of these things. I mean, just two very easy examples. I mean, that I could give, and in fact, they are two horror stories that have repeated themselves in almost the same way. You know, when in my part of the world, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc. So you had the support in the late 1970s. People are very much probably aware of this, of the so-called Mujahideen and these Islamist forces to oust the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan, etc. Now, who were these forces supported by? Yes, you can say the Saudis were some form of, yes, this religious monarchy. Otherwise, within Pakistan itself, okay, first of all, the entire Western political establishment, okay, you can say they're pretty secular. Pakistani generals, drinking generals, not very religious themselves, they could care less. So these folks are instrumentalized. Look at what's happened in Syria recently. Many Salafi jihadis, I mean, not all of obviously the opposition, but many Salafi jihadis, the most so-called secular state in the world, France, is allowing many of these guys to go out because to serve a particular interest. The overthrow of the Bashar regime, which may be a useful purpose. But what is going on here? These are issues of statecraft. This is what's going on, of nation states for very secular, this worldly purposes, utilizing a force which they know is very powerful to the hearts and minds of people, their beliefs, their religion, etc., but using it in such a way and distorting it in such a way and indoctrinating people. I mean, the people in Afghanistan, these kids, there were many of them orphans in madrasas, in religious seminaries, who were young kids who were taught in this way to go and fight by Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor of the United States, saying, well, this is your jihad and go fight them against Soviets. So this is my point. that in fact it is, what does this have to do with religion? But in fact, what it has to do with is nation states as using these forces to advance their very secular, this worldly interests in the whole arena of statecraft. That's what I wanted to add.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating and for your time today. It was a really good panel, I think, because we brought different perspectives together. Of course, I would like to reiterate that or female participants, they were actually having some issues and problems, as I already talked about it in the beginning of the webinar, but I feel like it's not recorded. It was not recorded. So I'm gonna repeat that. So it's not supposed to be an all-man panel, but unfortunately there were problems. And of course we would love, to have men talking about their views on violence, of course, because they are part of a society, and that's, I didn't want to cancel this webinar because of the absence of women, and everybody should have a have a say, and so we really appreciate that, and we're hoping to have more panels on this where there is diverse and we can bring different voices together to talk about it. And of course we have our responses to this panel as well that we're going to reflect on it in the future. So thank you very much. We're going to come back on January 30th, right, Ozlem, with a great panel on why women rights. Thank you so much, and see you on January 30th again. Thank you.
Most welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. See you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.